to Solving for the Undefined podcast. I'm your host, Johanna, founder of Ms. Kuiper's Classroom, the place that equips teachers in creating a healthy math classroom where students can thrive, no matter their academic abilities. But it's not always about the numbers, and that's why I'm here, bringing you the formulas to solve your problems, math and otherwise, plus strategies on cultivating that necessary math mindset. And that's what you can count on.
All right. Hello. Welcome to a brand new episode. Today we are joined by Juliana Tapper, and I'm so excited to have you here. I've been a longtime fan of everything that you have to offer, so it's such a cool experience to be able to have you on the show. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. I'm Juliana Tapper, and I help 6th through 12th grade math teachers increase engagement of students who struggle. I was a high school math intervention teacher and high school algebra 1 teacher. I taught in South Central Los Angeles, East San Jose, and Denver. We moved to Colorado when we moved here. I've also been a district math coach, a district TOSA, and started my consulting business full-time in 2018. And most importantly, probably for this episode, I'm the author of the book Teaching 612 Math Intervention, a framework to engage students who struggle. So I'm super excited about that. It is coming out shortly.
Yes, and you just recently shared with me before we started recording that it hit number 1 in secondary education, right, on Amazon?
Yes, it is officially a bestseller. So excited to be on that journey. And yeah.
That's so cool. I love that. So, and we actually had an interesting connection too. I grew up in the Bay Area and Utah in East San Jose, and they're like super close to each other because I lived probably like 20 minutes from there growing up. So that is such a cool, fun little connection.
Yeah, shout out to Yerba Buena High School and all my East Siders.
Yes, we actually played them in a couple of sports when I was in high school. So
that's so crazy.
Yeah. So we are here talking about strategies for students who are struggling with math. And one thing that we see often is students coming into the classroom with math anxiety or math trauma. Can you share a little bit about what may have caused those emotions for students coming into the classroom?
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really interesting. Like, I think some teachers hear math anxiety and they are relieved. They're like, oh my gosh, I think that's like what it is. I think that's impacting my students. And I think some teachers hear math anxiety or math trauma and they kind of want to fluff it off, saying like, oh, that's not a real thing, or we can't just blame everything on math anxiety or math trauma. And so I think it's really interesting that like there are a lot of teachers that hold both viewpoints. And so while I was writing the book, I was doing a lot of research on math anxiety and math trauma. And I think like one of the most interesting things, and then I'll talk about like how we get math anxiety and math trauma, but I think something that I didn't know was that they've actually taken MRIs of students' brains who have math anxiety, and they see that when they see numbers, they have hyperactivity in their amygdala. That's particularly the brain center that it goes into just hyperactive mode. And when that happens, that's our primal brain. That's our fight or flight mode. And so they have actually proven that when that hyperactivity is taking place, students struggle to recall. Students struggle to retain information. Students struggle to problem solve. It is literally like impedes the problem solving centers of the brain. And so so many teachers are saying, my kids don't know how to multiply. My kids can't remember how to multiply. They don't remember what I taught them yesterday, today. And the problem might not actually be how we're teaching them. The problem might be that we haven't done enough to like calm down that hyperactivity in their amygdala so that they can recall information that they did learn, that they can retain information, and that they can problem solve. So I think that is like what's most fascinating to me about the brain research on math anxiety. So that was like a light bulb moment for me. And as I've been sharing it with the schools that I work with, they're like, okay, how can we calm down the amygdala? Like that has to be our primary focus, and how we start like every period is calming the amygdala. So yeah, I think that is like fascinating, that like something that I didn't know. But in terms of how are those things caused? I mean, I think it is unfortunately getting an answer wrong publicly. Maybe they get laughed at by students. Maybe they get laughed at or just dismissed by a teacher. If they say, what's 3 times 5? And someone says 14, and the teacher is just is like, oh, or something like that could ignite that could be a math trauma for that student. And now anytime they see multiplication, that the multiplication triggers that trauma for them. And it's like they're right back in that moment. And it's hard for them to access all those parts of the brain that they need to move forward, like in a positive direction with math. So I think it's a lot of I think it does have to do a lot with like basic skills and like sort of trauma that happens when they're doing fractions in front of the class, when they're doing multiplication in front of the class. I think those are like the most likely culprits.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense thinking about like my own experience. I didn't have math anxiety, but when it came to like language arts, when like figuring out figurative language and all of that, that's something that always like was challenging for me. And I remember a time where I shared something and it was considered wrong by the teacher and how it made me feel. And so I can see how people would have that same reaction for math and they get an answer wrong, or someone ridicules for them for not knowing how to do something, and how traumatizing that can be. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the study that you shared and how in the MRI you can like see that hyperactivity, knowing how validating that can be for some people, knowing that I'm not making this up, like this is a real thing that's happening to me. I can see that being more of like a relief, knowing that it's a true thing. It's not something that someone made up to try and get out of doing math. It's something that we now have to work with and see how can we get these students to, with math anxiety, still be able to be successful and feel successful in the math classroom.
Yes. And there is also research on, how we can help lessen that math anxiety. So we can get into that next or a little bit later. So like, not just like, oh man, this really sucks, but like there are things we can do.
Yeah. And thinking about that, what things might we see from students that would indicate that they have math anxiety or math trauma?
So knowing that there is hyperactivity in the amygdala, we can look for that amygdala response, that primal brain response, which is fight or flight. But actually now researchers are saying there's 4 primal brain responses. There's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are the other ones. So like fight might look like when students are being disrespectful, when they're balling up their paper, throwing it in the trash can saying, nah, miss, I ain't doing this, or whatever, like all sort of being combative, even like, no, I'm not participating. That is actually an indicator that like they are in their primal brain, that amygdala is hyperactive, whether it's from actual trauma, like, maybe it is like a big T trauma that's happening outside of the math class, or maybe it is math trauma. But either way, like when they're combative like that, it's a good indicator that perhaps that's some math anxiety or math trauma. When someone's always asking you to go to the bathroom during your class, when someone's always ditching your class, that is flight. That is their primal brain reaction to, I don't know how to control this situation, so I am just going to leave the situation. And then freeze is when they just like kind of do nothing. And so, it is just like when we feel like students are apathetic, that's a word that I'm hearing more and more from teachers. When they're doing nothing in the classroom, that is just their primal brain having a freeze response to the fear that they feel around mathematics. Or again, it could be because they're having a trauma outside of the classroom as well. And then fawn is like an attempt to become a teacher's pet. But still actually doesn't do very much work, but they're just kind of, trying to get on your good side so that maybe you give them a passing grade just because, oh, this kid is so nice. That could also be, that's like the fawn primal response.
Interesting. I definitely hadn't heard of those last two being
Yeah.
like, but I can see it now that I'm thinking about like some of the students in my classroom, like it makes sense. So it'll be interesting for me going back on Monday, kind of seeing how all of that can play into things. So what strategies can you share to help teachers work effectively with these students?
Yeah, so I think we really do need to look to trauma-informed practices. And I know that's kind of a buzzword. I know that can kind of be like a trigger for teachers, like, oh, I'm tired of talking about trauma-informed responses. Like, I totally get that. But I think we can take trauma-informed research and like apply it specifically to like math trauma and math anxiety. So I like to say that there's like 4 activities like that we can do to help give our students hope in mathematics, and then using hope as an acronym. So the H stands for honesty. Just, answering honestly when students are asking, we always get, hey, miss, when am I going to use this in real life? And however you want to answer that with students, but just being honest with them about the purpose of mathematics, about how important it is. The O in that HOPE acronym stands for ownership. So a huge trauma-informed practice is to help students take ownership of their situation. So in math, that could look like co-creating some norms. That could look like, I love to co-define the word respect in our classroom. And so I go in depth into all 4 of the, like an activity for all 4 of these in the book, Teaching 612 Math Intervention. But I love to just co-define the word respect. I feel like that works well for like older students. Instead of saying, let's talk about norms, I like to say, let's define the word respect. What does it look like to do math respectfully? And you're going to get a lot of good, like that's going to help students feel a sense of ownership in there. And then the P in HOPE stands for purpose. We want to help them see the purpose of mathematics. I like to connect it to like a larger purpose of, why do we want to pass this class? Why do you come to this class every day? And even connecting it outside of just, I want to learn the things and pass the class, but I want to graduate from high school. Math is like the number one gatekeeper of keeping students from graduating high school. So helping them connect to see, I have to pass this class to graduate. I have to pass Algebra 1 to graduate. And like connecting to that deeper purpose can really help overcome that math anxiety and math trauma. And then the last one, E, is explain. And this one has a lot of research behind it, that when students, there's actually a study on this, that when students write about their math anxiety or their math trauma, it actually frees up that space in the brain for them to be able to recall, retain, problem solve. So I think it's so important that if we think we have students with math anxiety, that we are giving them an opportunity to share that with us in writing, because there are studies that prove just writing about it helps them to overcome it. So those are like, I think those are like the most important ways teachers can, we have to like address the community. I know you're a big proponent of classroom community, and like, we have to start there. When we have students who struggle, when we have students with math anxiety or math trauma, we have to calm down that amygdala if anything is going to happen. And we do that by building community.
I love that. That makes a lot of sense. And I love the H part, the being honest, because I think a lot of teachers will try and like say like, oh, like you'll need it for if you do this job or this job. And while it's totally true, you do need it for very specific jobs, it is also like outside their realm right now.
Yes.
Of like, I teach 8th graders and I teach also an accelerated class for Algebra 1, and they have to pass that class in order to graduate from high school. And so giving them the perspective of, you're going to need this math because Algebra 1 expands on everything that we learn in 8th grade. Or for my accelerated class, like you need to pass this class in order to graduate. So it gives them a little bit more reasoning behind why math is important right now. Because the job is going to be like way in the future for them, at least from their perspective. And it's not going to give them the motivation that right now gives them.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that, because I feel like every time I say like, oh, be honest with your students about why math matters, like everyone's like, oh, you need the problem solving ability because you need it in all these jobs. And I'm like, can we just be real? Like, you need this class to graduate from high school. And I also would always tell my students, like the state of whatever, California, Colorado, I've taught in both states. And it's like, the state of Colorado says that you need to pass this class to graduate. That's why this class matters. Like,
exactly.
Let's be honest. Like, let's be real. Like, everyone has these like beautiful, like math is beautiful responses. So like, thanks for keeping it real with me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I definitely will also add like the problem solving and the collaboration, but it's not as effective for students as telling them like, you need to pass this class to graduate.
Yes.
So we're on the same page.
I love that.
All right. So kind of moving into more of like some classroom stuff. I recently did an episode debunking kind of guided notes, worksheets, and homework, and it's been very interesting to see the response. So I know this one's a big one for you, but cold calling. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, and before we started recording, I was like, I'm going to be honest that like I tend to be a little more traditional, and like I left the classroom before the book Building Thinking Classrooms came out, and so I'm excited for this part of the episode because I think we can model like respectful disagreeing, and also just realize that like I think as math teachers we tend to really think like black and white, like my classroom has to be 100% building thinking classrooms, or my classroom has to be 100% explicit instruction. But instead, like, what if it were shades of gray and like we kind of like used both, or, use all of these different tools when needed? So, okay, so cold calling, super unpopular opinion, but I am a big fan of cold calling. And I do mean like, I literally stand there with index cards with students' names, and I just use the index cards for every single question. And so my thinking behind being pro cold calling is, I've always taught intervention, high school intervention. I've always taught high school algebra 1 and, or 11th, 12th graders that still haven't passed algebra 1, things like that. And the thing is like, for their entire educational career, teachers have let them just sit in the back of the classroom and not answer the questions. And I just feel my students that I have always taught have personally they're not just going to one day wake up and be like, I think I'm going to participate today. So instead, I just made participation the norm with those cold calling cards. And I think a lot of math teachers don't want to do the cold calling cards because they feel like that ignites math trauma, that ignites cold calling, or that ignites math anxiety, all those things we just talked about. So I get that. And if we have built the community that you and I both know is so important, I have never had students feel like that ignited math anxiety. I have only ever had students say like, you believed we could do it and you made us do it. And so I know it can be kind of scary to think about cold calling on students. And I would say you cannot do it unless you have done intentional community building activities for students who struggle. Those like hope activities that we just talked about that are in the book, like you have to do those first. You cannot just start cold calling on day one. That would be a disaster, and that would be math anxiety mania. But once you have built that community, I actually do love cold calling. So what's your hot take?
So it's kind of a mixture. I think there's nothing wrong with cold calling as long as it's set up correctly. Yes, definitely community is a huge aspect of it, because if you're called on, you don't have that like anxiety of like, what is this person going to think when I don't know or something. And there's like that safety net. But also setting up cold calling, like you have the cards with their names on it. I use like the popsicle sticks with the desk number on it. And if that's part of the culture that you use in your classroom, students get used to it and they know that it's coming. There's a difference between doing cold calling that way and doing cold calling of looking around the room and choosing a student you think is not paying attention. That's actively damaging your students and your classroom community. And that is not how cold calling should work. So when we talk about cold calling, we're thinking very different than maybe some people are thinking. And
thank
I
you.
think that makes a huge difference. Another thing that I do is to prepare before the cold calling is have students write down their answer. I use whiteboards all the time, like mini whiteboards. So we'll do a problem or something and I'll have them write it out. So that way, when it comes time to share, they have something in front of them. So it's not when I call on them, it's like a sudden like freeze, like I don't know what to say. It's written in front of them. And I also give them time to talk with their group of 3 beforehand. So if they don't have something, they can steal their partner's answer. And I don't care about that. Like, as long as they're communicating, collaborating, and they have something ready to share, it's a win in my book. So,
yes, amen, amen, amen. In the book, I share my Math Wars method, and it does include cold calling, and it does exactly what you just talked about. It gives students time to work together, check their answers with someone so that if they are called on, they don't feel that put on the spot. Like they've had 3 other people to check their answers with before they've been cold called on for like a final answer for something.
yes. So, I love that. And I'm glad that's out there. People can hear it and hopefully see some things and maybe choose that today to work on in their classroom. Awesome. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is explicit instruction. I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this one. So I feel like, there are two types of math instruction, like super prominent right now, like inquiry based, building thinking classrooms where students are working through tasks. They're working on kind of discovering some stuff. They're working on all of that, the illustrative math, all of that. I think is kind of one side of it. And then the other side of it is like the more traditional or explicit or gradual release being like the I do, we do, you do. So I feel like there's like two camps there. And I really do believe that like we should be a shade of gray. And I really do believe that like we should figure out what is best for our students who are struggling. And we should teach our class that way. If our class is thriving with a building thinking classrooms approach and our students who struggle are thriving with that, we should do that. If our students need some more explicit instruction, and especially our students who struggle need some more explicit instruction, we should do that. Like, I believe that we should be meeting the needs of the students, not just how do I like to teach math best, but really how do my kids learn math best. And so I'm a big fan. Like I said, I left the classroom before building thinking classrooms came out, but I was still in the classroom when illustrative math was on the rise. And so I'm a big fan of doing tasks. Those are great ways to get kids engaged in the topic, to get students thinking outside just like the box of step 1, step 2, step 3. I think it is very important. But I do tend to feel like, at least again, for my students in high school math intervention, there was so much fear around math, so much desire to not engage, that starting with just, hey, let's go work on some whiteboards, like on a task, like feels a little like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. And so, I did have a much more explicit approach. That Math Wars method that I mentioned, which is also in the book, detailed in the book, is an explicit instruction strategy. And I do believe like that structure that explicit instruction can provide is important, but I do not believe what we should be doing is like 20 minutes of I do, like 20 minutes of direct instruction, and then 20 minutes of we do, like where they're working on a worksheet. I see that all the time in the classrooms that I coach in. Like, that is not effective. Let me be perfectly clear. The Math Wars method is actually like one problem I do, one problem very similar a we do, one problem very similar a you do as your team. Like, that's where we talk about that group work, that, and then we're going to cold call at the end of that. Like, it's a structured approach to that. And yes, like, I am modeling something that I'm having you practice it, but it's also allowing students to take ownership. It's allowing students to, have something to truly work on with a group, and then hold them accountable at the end for like a final answer. And so I think a lot of the ways that math teachers do traditional instruction is not effective for students who struggle. If we are just talking for 20 minutes and then they're working on a worksheet, that's not going to work for students who struggle. They need immediate feedback. They need formative feedback, checks for understanding throughout the lesson, so that we know if they're getting it in real time and not a week later when they take a quiz.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And I think my answer is going to be similar to the cold calling. I think for me, it's a combination of both. The way that I start lessons or start units is always with some sort of low floor, high ceiling type problem where students can use any math to solve the problem. And I think that's powerful for students because no matter what level they're at, they can find a way to solve this problem. And if not, they can take a guess. Or they have partners in their group who have a better understanding and can take a guess. And I think that's the first way I do it, kind of more of a discovery. But after that, later on, like, I do more of a direct or explicit instruction. And the way I do it is not 20 minutes, but I have it set out. So I'm doing some problems on the screen and students have nothing in their hands. They are just watching, they are just listening. And I'll do a problem, I'll explain some things, and then I have them turn and talk about whatever we just did. And so kind of like a bit of recall. And then I'll continue on with whatever teaching if there's more, and then I'll have them like do another recall. And then we get into doing that practice together. So sometimes it'll look like I will start a problem and they'll fill in the blanks. I call them problem skeletons. And then I'll have them do like a full problem on their own. And this whole time, like, they're doing it with their team. They're not alone in this. And so they can kind of like check together as they work along. So that's how I do it. So it's a little bit of combination of like that discovery piece, having students use whatever knowledge they have to solve a problem. And then it's that like more direct or explicit instruction. And one thing too with the discovery piece is I'm not expecting perfection during that time. Like not every group's going to get to an answer. We usually set a 15-minute timer for students to work through that task style problem. And then we go and watch a resolution video. And we use a curriculum called Mid-School Math. And if you haven't heard of it, for people listening, I have done a lot of math curriculums in my time. This is by far the easiest as a teacher to follow and for students to do. It is hands down fabulous. It is so cool. It starts off with like a simulation video that has a problem, and then students work on that problem. And then there's like a resolution video that they watch. And so it's really cool to have that like end piece to hook them back in so they can see how that person solved it. So it's really cool.
That's amazing. I mean, I've heard about mid-school math. I was about to present at one of their conferences, but then I had a baby, so it didn't work out. But like, I think the conference was 2 days before I ended up going into labor. So
Whoa.
that timing wasn't so good. But I've heard of it before, and that's really cool to know that you use it. And like, I love the idea that that's already a resolution video is already done for you. Like, that's incredible. I love that.
Yeah.
And like, thank you so much for validating the like shades of gray, that like it is okay to do both, you know, like sometimes I just feel really vulnerable sharing that like I am pro explicit instruction. But when I really think about it, like I did do illustrative math tasks with my kids. You know, I do truly believe that those tasks are vital in our classes. So it shouldn't be 100% just explicit instruction. So like to just hear you validate that, like makes me feel like, you know, more, I'm not like a horrible person.
No, definitely not a horrible person. Because I think on the flip side too, like we wouldn't want 100% discovery and only that. Because students would discover something, but then there would never be something to like ground it or have that foundation. So it would just be always this like floating idea of like, oh, I saw this, but what does it actually mean? And so I think you have to have like those shades of gray of like you take it, you have students discover it, and then you build a foundation for what they discovered. And I do that with like my geometric transformations. We look at pictures and like, what do you notice? And then we kind of take that and ground it of like, this is what we call a translation. See how it's just moving and it looks the same. And so there's actually a conference coming up called Educator Exponential, where there's 13 of us this year. And we're all talking about different ways that you can teach certain topics with that discovery piece in mind.
Ooh.
And then how to take that discovery and kind of ground it more into the topic. So really cool. It's a free conference, October 18th through 22nd. Free ticket, and you can come and see all of those fascinating things. It's for grades 5 through 8. So
amazing.
Yes, very excited about that coming up. All right. So one last thing for us to talk about in terms of some interesting things that people always have strong opinions about: fluency practice.
Yes. So with this one, I really do feel like our whole conversation about math anxiety, math trauma, I believe a lot of those things start with that basic skill practice in earlier grades, and then it just gets out of control. And so I do not believe that the drill and kill worksheets are what is best for students to practice fluency, especially in upper grades. I believe, you know, we can't keep hounding them with memorize your multiplication table, memorize all your multiplication facts. Like, they have math anxiety, they have math trauma. We just learned that their amygdala is hyperactive. They literally cannot retain information. They literally cannot recall the facts that you want them to recall, and forcing it on them with forced multiplication memorization, with drill and kill worksheets. If someone has math anxiety, it's when they see numbers that amygdala goes hyperactive. Can you imagine looking at a whole page of drill and kill practice and like that amygdala is like literally melting, like, you know? And so I do not believe that like drill and kill is the best way to do fluency practice with older students. Yes, they do need to know how to multiply. I'm a big fan of having a large multiplication chart up in your room. And when you are modeling problem solving, look at your multiplication table and say like, okay, I'm going across the 6 until I get to the 7. Okay, it's 42. Like model how you are using the multiplication table. And then also, I believe that like have some non-calculator, number talks time, like do a warm up of a number talk that is like, 14 times 27, something, and do a number talk the way number talks are supposed to be done, to get students just deeply thinking about what multiplication is. But I do not believe we need to pause our grade level content to make sure students have mastered multiplication, adding, subtracting of negatives. I know that's something you and I are very much aligned on, like the importance of grade level expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the time as a coach, I will see Algebra 1 teachers in high school still doing fractions, still doing multiplication, division in December, when I go into classrooms. And that is not like the way to do it either. Like do a fluency Friday, do something. I think tied in with this, I was going to ask if we could throw in another hot topic of calculator use, but it really fits here. Like I believe if our students are trying to access grade level content, give them the calculator, let them help for that grade level access. And then do things like Fluency Friday or, whatever, where they are practicing without the calculator. But we need to get them doing grade level math. That's going to just benefit them in so many ways. And so I'm like pro calculator for, accessing grade level content. What's your hot take on fluency practice?
So I don't do a whole lot of fluency practice just because I don't know how to sometimes. But I agree with a lot of things that you said. Like I don't have a multiplication chart up in my classroom, but I have them available to students. But I have the skip counting charts up on my wall for like 1 through 12, and I use those. And I love how you said like model it for your students. So like if we're doing a problem and we're trying to figure out 42 gets divided by what? And we look over and like, okay, I see it on the 6, and what else do you guys see it on? Oh, it's on the 7. And so we're getting that practice together and normalizing the use of it. Because I think sometimes if you just have it up on your wall, it can be kind of more decoration than like something people can use unless you model using it and showing that this is something we use. It's okay to use this. I think that's a huge piece of it. I'm definitely going to get a multiplication chart on my wall now. I really like that idea.
Yeah. So. And I feel like, a lot of teachers, especially about the calculator, they'll say, oh, well, they can't use it on a state test, so I don't want them to get in the habit of using the calculator. But most of our kids are using it for multiplication and division. And so what I would teach my students is to, as soon as you get a test, flip it over, make a multiplication chart. We use it every day in class, make it on your test. And when you need to use it, use it. Really and that smart. Helps, like, if they are using the calculator for those basic things to access grade level content, they do have like a fallback.
Yeah. And I agree 100% with you on the calculator use. I don't know why teachers don't let kids use them. Like it's a great tool for kids to use.
Yes.
And even if we still want them to do like the math like in their head or on paper, it's a great tool for students to check their work and to feel like more confident and like, oh yeah, I knew it was 15. It gives them that sense of like confidence and belief in themselves. So it makes more sense to have it than to like not have it. So,
yeah. And when I think about how I problem solve in real life, I use my calculator because I want to do it quickly. And I want to like, maybe I'm like, oh, that didn't look right. That didn't seem right. And like, I can easily go through and do it on my calculator instead of sitting there doing long division, in the grocery store.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there are some times and places where teachers feel like they can't use it, like when like integer operations when students are first learning, and I get that, but there are other tools that we can like put in place to make sure that students have that, and a calculator is always a great way to check your work. So
yes. And model counting on your fingers, for integer operations. Like when I am adding and subtracting negative numbers, like I will always be like, okay, I have a negative 10 plus 7. Okay, there are more negatives, so I know it's going to be negative, and then it's the difference. So 7, 8, 9, 10. Like, and show my kids that I'm counting on my fingers, okay, the answer is -3. Like model that, like use your fingers. There is research that like when you're using your fingers, it's helping to make stronger connections in students' brains. So always be okay with fingers. Sometimes kids are using their fingers under the desk because they feel so embarrassed, but no, like model it, because there's nothing wrong with using your fingers, even in upper grades. It's helping to strengthen those neural connections.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too, I've seen it in my classroom where students will make fun of another kid for using their fingers. And so if you are showing that, you're helping normalize that and making it okay for students to do and helping take away that like stigma of it. Because
Yeah,
it's a great tool for students to use, like making math visual for themselves. So, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, and you touched on something while we were talking about that, about we still have like grade level expectations, even when students aren't always performing at grade level with their like fluency skills. So, what are some ways that teachers can show and maintain those high expectations for all students?
Yeah. So in the book, I detail my just in time math intervention method and model. And, just in time scaffolding was made popular by Julie Dixon, an education researcher. And there's really two schools of intervention. And it's just in case intervention and just in time intervention. Just in case is where we're filling all the gaps just in case they missed them. So as a high school math intervention teacher, I would teach all of the middle school content just in case they missed it, versus a just in time approach to intervention is when we teach prerequisite skills that they might have missed just in time for the grade level content. So I always give the example of like multi-step equations being the algebra 1 grade content. So that's my goal. I want to get to a multi-step equation. That means students need to know how to do two-step equations. That means they need to do one-step equations. That means they need to know how to combine like terms. They need to know distributive property. So yeah, it's going to take me like an extra week to get to multi-step equations. But my goal is always to get to the grade level content and to scaffold what they have missed right before, just in time for that grade level content. So like I detail that in the book, Teaching 612 Math Intervention. And I wouldn't suggest this for teachers unless I had lived it myself. And in my first two schools, I taught intervention and my admin told me to teach middle school content. So I did. And then at my third school, my admin told me, you know what, we know that they failed math in middle school, but we just need you to teach integrated math 1. And I was like, oh my gosh, like what on earth? This is not a good idea. Like you've lost your mind. But I went in there the next day and I told my kids, okay, I believe you can do grade level content. So we're going to do grade level content. And like the shift in their mindset of like, oh my gosh, she believes in me. And then I actually have to follow through, right? I can't say, I believe you can do grade level content. So we're going to do grade level content and be like, here's a, third grade fraction worksheet the next day. Like we actually had to do grade level content. I had to show them with my actions. But like the gains my kids made that year, it was like astounding. Like, I'm just like, every teacher has to know about this. And so it's in the book.
That's awesome. I love that.
I know you are very much like a just in time person of like,
Yes.
we have to give our kids access to grade level content.
Yes. It also, like, when you take that time to take that step back and kind of work backwards, it gives time students to build confidence towards whatever you're doing. And you gave the example of multi-step equations. And for my Algebra 1 students, we do that too. We start back at distributive property, combining like terms, two-step equations, variables on both sides, and then get into those like multi-step equations. Because along the way, yes, they may have remembered it from the grade before, and it might feel easy for some students, and while others are still needing that extra practice, they're all building that confidence to be able to do those higher level multi-step equations. So while some people may think it's time wasted, I think it's time saved because they are getting that confidence, and you don't have to in the moment be like, yes, we can do this, which they can, but it gives them that own intrinsic confidence rather than us being like, I know you can do this, let's get down to it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So kind of as we wrap up, we've talked a lot about a lot of things. Was there anything else you kind of wanted to share in regards to the topics we've talked about?
No, I feel like we covered it. This was great.
Yes. No. This was a fabulous conversation. I loved it so much. So, what are some resources that you have that can help teachers learn more?
Yes, so definitely my book, Teaching 612 Math Intervention. It is, when this episode comes out, it will be available for pre-order. It's not shipping until December 30th of 2024. But so to, help teachers put their trust in me and the book, I am offering like over $400 of bonus content that you get immediately. So I talked a lot about the Math Wars method in this episode. And so I actually give immediate access to my Math Wars method workshop. So even though you'll get it's all detailed in the book, if you pre-order, you get the whole workshop as soon as you pre-order. You just register it on my site. So that's gatebreakerbook.com, because we're going to be gate breakers, breaking this gatekeeping mathematics. So gatebreakerbook.com has all the information about pre-ordering and getting access to those like $400 of bonuses.
Awesome. That's so cool. I love that you give out the Math Wars too, because I've seen so many people talk about it and see how it has impacted them in their classroom and their students.
Yeah, so this is a great way to get access. I mean, the book is kind of expensive. It's $34.99. And so I realized, okay, it's not shipping till December, and okay, that's kind of expensive. So to make it worth it, a lot of people have been talking about Math Wars, and you get it for that cost now, which is insane. So definitely go pre-order.
Awesome. All right. So, and I will have the link down in this description, so you can just click on it and be transported to awesomeness. All right. One thing that I always ask in every interview is, what is your favorite math-related joke or pun?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could do a little musical rendition of my favorite math song. How about that?
Do it. I'd love that.
Okay. All right. So warming up my vocal cords, quadratic formula set to the tune of Lil Jon, Get Low.
Oh my goodness.
I think this will be good. Are you ready? My kids loved it. My students always were like, Miss, you are doing the most. And like, this is so awkward, but they loved it. All right. So it goes negative b plus or minus the square root of a b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, all over 2a. So there we go.
That's awesome. And I bet kids remembered it so much better than just like telling them what it was.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's always like what's that other one that it's like the Jack in the Box or something. I can't remember how a lot of teachers teach quadratic formula with a song. It's like some nursery rhyme. I'm like, my 11th graders repeating algebra for the third time are not caring about a nursery rhyme.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I love that you put that in there. Okay, so where can people find you to learn more about who you are?
Yeah, Instagram is really the best place. I'm collaborated.with.juliana, and all my stuff is there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I've really enjoyed this. So thank you so much for being here.
I've really enjoyed it too. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Of course. And with that, I'll calculate her.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. To find all the links and resources to things talked about in this episode, head on over to MissKuipersClassroom.com and click on podcast.